here's the shutter case. It's important that that's not all filled up with dirt and grease, otherwise things don't run smoothly at all. The track inside here is where the curved rack and the pusher work, and they should be nice and clear. Just running around the outside, making sure that's all clean, no problems there. Here's the curved pusher piece. And here's the curved rack. There's usually not much to go wrong with these pieces. Right, so what I normally do is take the curved pusher piece, give it a wipe on the inside, top and bottom edges, and the outside with molybdenum paste, and you can see I'm just leaving a sort of a dirty mark on there and no more. The same with the curved rack. That'll do for that. So putting all this together. Alright, start with the curved rack, drop that in over the slots there. Here's the curved pusher piece. I've got a piece of fluff there from my cotton bud. It's caught on that flash contact. Just make sure that's sitting in the case. Both pieces. And in the case here, the tab on our shutter needs to drop back behind that pusher piece. So I usually cock the shutter and slide the shutter into the case. And rotate that round until the screw holes are lined up. And the flash contact, I'm just making sure that that couples to the contact on the back of the shutter. Looks like it's good. And there are 3 screws. Now the large one goes here, and that serves to hold the shutter case to the back of the shutter. It also serves to locate the shutter in the camera body. And then we've got 2 small flathead or countersunk head screws there. The smaller diameter one goes over on this little arm over here. And the larger diameter one goes into this position. Check that those 3 screws are good. Run this set screw in to clamp our flash contact. And that's the shutter back in the outer case, and you can cock it by getting the tip of your tweezers on the end of the arm there, pulling that down, and you can cock the shutter. That part's easy enough. Now the front rings. Front rings, we've got the settings ring for the shutter speeds. We've got this little ring here which couples to the aperture setting there. This piece, which is the repeater, basically that brings our aperture settings numbers to the top of the shutter so you can see them. And then we've got the front plate, and this is where the lens bayonets into, or the lens hood in this case. Of course our retaining ring's currently sitting on the shutter already, we've got to take that off. So these pieces I just need to clean with a bit of naphtha, and by the time you get to this stage all the difficult stuff's been dealt with the shutter. This is in good condition. sometimes this ring might be rusty, or it might have some corrosion on it, and that's indicative of the shutter or the camera having been splashed at some stage and water having got down into it. If you polish that off with a bit of brass or something, probably that's all that's required. There'll be a lot of grease on the back of this. Graphite grease, typically it's very messy. I do my best not to get absolutely covered in it. The only reason we're really removing it is there's an excessive amount of it, and it'll have picked up any dust and rubbish. Will have gotten picked up like any other grease will pick dust up, and it becomes a grinding compound. So I just want to get that clean. Getting graphite grease off things is never particularly easy. Anodised aluminium pieces like this, it sort of embeds itself into the surface. You end up with that silvery finish on it whether you wanted it or not. Fortunately that's the inside, no one's ever going to see it. Alright, and this setting ring, the same deal, make sure that's nice and clean. Run that round the outside groove there, removing any dust and rubbish that might be present. And the inside ring, much the same. Okay, that looks good. Bring the shutter back in. Okay, so first I've got to remove my retaining ring, which I'd put on there while I was testing the shutter. This piece, I normally just give that a light wipe with molybdenum paste. Bottom surface and in through the centre and around the outside surface. And that drops into position through the hole in the slot in that piece. And then we've got to get things coupled up. So you're trying to couple up two things. These two notches in the ring, here and here, couple here and here. This little tab on the bottom couples into this fork on the aperture setting lever at the bottom. So normally I get that fork seat, that tab into the fork first, rotate my shutter speed ring and get that seated. And if I check this, as I turn it, the aperture setting will move with it. So that's all looking good. Here is the aperture numbers, the ring with the aperture numbers. It's got a notch on the bottom of it, which couples up with a tiny tab on that inside ring. You've got to get that notch seated correctly. Often that'll pop up because that ring underneath it may have some spring tension on it. That's okay. Now taking some molybdenum paste. These series of notches here, they provide our detent for our shutter speed settings. So I'm just wiping some molybdenum paste over those. And this fits into place in only one position. There's a little notch in the back of it. Where is it? Here. It seats in one position, so I'll get this correct. I think that their number setting ring just dropped off its notch, did it? No, it's right. Okay, I've just rotated that. Our number plate here points off to the side. That's all looking good. I can put my retaining ring in place. Usually that goes on without any fuss. You see I'm using finger and thumb to get that started because it's quite thin, it's quite a fine thread. It's easy to get that cross-threaded if you weren't watching or if you were forcing it. Now just check the action, that all looks good. Checking that the shutter speed action is smooth, but it has a positive click stop. If you overdo the tightening of the retaining ring, you'll find that the changing the speeds is very stiff. That won't work at all. So I'll back that off. It's still too tight. Now there are multiple positions that you can fit the retaining screw, so we just need to back that ring off to a point where the tension feels good, the resistance feels good, and we've got a hole that we can get a screw in. That's probably a good spot. So I've got the hole visible there for the retaining screw. Now the retaining screw was that little black one which right at the beginning of the shutter servicing videos jumped off and had to be found. But that's it. I'm going to see if I can get this screwed in place. This screw is always a bit tricky. It's very small. It's quite a small diameter, but it's only got a couple of threads. It's very shallow. So it's not easy to get this thing seated sometimes. I'm just going to have to get some better glasses. I can't see what I'm doing. Okay, if I can get this in the light. No, I can't see what I'm doing here. The light's too poor. I'm going to have to move. Okay, let's see if I do any better here. I was working under artificial light over there and it's just not good enough. That screw just doesn't want to start there. Let me just check that that ring's in the correct. Just move that ring very slightly. I'll do what I told you not to do. I moved it with my tweezers. That was it. Presenting the screw up square to the thread was the problem there. It was canting off to one side. As I say, it's a very short screw. It's very difficult to deal with. But that aside, our shutter is now ready to go back in the camera. Well, I've got to put the lenses in it, of course, and then the shutter can go back in the body. Okay. Alright, just using some domestic glass cleaner here. Just clean the inside of the front group. A little bit of dust there, nothing serious. Taking a fresh cotton bud, I'll do the outside of the front group, or the front surface. A bit more dust on there. Just making sure there's no smears or fingerprints. A bit of a oily smear there. And something still on the inside I can see. We always like to have the glass absolutely sparkling and free from smears, but probably little smears make no difference at all. They look impressive with their colouring, but they probably make no difference to your image. Right, so pop the front group in place, lining up the red dots. And just clockwise that clicks into place. That's our front group. It was easy enough. Let's do the rear group, same deal. Let's get a bit of domestic glass cleaner on here. This lens is in very good order. There's nothing to see really here. Right, so the inside's done. I'll put that back in the shutter. Tighten that up. That just goes up finger tight. And another cotton bud. With some glass cleaner to the rear surface. That looks pretty good too. Our retaining ring and the shims, they need to be cleaned because they're quite greasy. I'll just bring that paper towel back in. Serviette. Where's my naphtha? You may find one or more metal shims, one or more paper shims. Be careful getting the paper shim clean. They're easily torn. This is one of the thicker ones. Which isn't quite so bad to deal with. The thin ones are really like tissue paper, they tear quite easily. And here I'm just cleaning the retaining ring. You can see that's got a lot more dirt on it, not more grease. Just clean that inside and out. Right, so there's our 3 pieces. Now, I normally put any paper shim, I normally put that on first, then put on the metal shim. That way the paper shim is protected while you're wriggling the shutter into place on the camera body, which of course is the next task. Okay, so let's start with this. Just check the shutter's not cocked. It's not cocked. Make sure I've got my shim in place. Present the lens up, the shutter up to the camera body. Now, what are you watching here? Well, you're watching various things. One of the things you're watching is to make sure that your shutter release lever here is underneath the finger on the body that releases it. And the shutter should set into the body, and it's located by that screw on the back of the shutter. That feels quite good. Now I need to make sure that the timing of the gear is correct, so I'm just going to try cocking the shutter and see what happened. Now the shutter didn't cock, so the shutter's not advanced far enough, so I'll bring my shutter up to the close focus position so that I can access this little tooth cam here. I'm going to lift the shutter out, have contact with the gear behind it, move that forward a notch, drop it back into position, check that everything's seated, try the shutter, the film advance again. Shutter still doesn't cock, so I need to come forward even more. So I'll lift the shutter slightly, move that forward another tooth, try again. Now that time the shutter fire cocked nicely. And what I'm listening for at this stage is to hear the shutter cocking before the film advance gets to the end of its stroke and releases. That's the shutter, that's the film advance. So that's good. The timing there is good. So holding that firmly between finger and thumb, I can place the retaining ring in, and if I had the tool handy I'd run that up. Right, the tool in hand, I can run up that retaining ring, check the action again. That seems good. I'll snug that ring up. Now that time, it most definitely released the shutter, and I released my finger from the shutter button, release button, before I'd released the film advance. So we've got the adjustment to make at the top here again. But I'll just check the action of this shutter, the cocking action. I'm listening for that shutter to cock. That's the shutter, that's the film advance. So that part's right. My timing, my adjustment, my shutter release is now slightly off. It's no problem if you're a heavy-handed bloke, but if you're doing what you should be doing and squeezing very gently on the shutter release, see if I can do it. That's released the shutter. Oh, it did release the film advance that time. My adjustment might be still good. No, that time it did not. That time it did not release the film advance, so my adjustment still needs to be made. It's just I'm so heavy-handed that I managed to defeat that every time. Now that's number one, so that tells us nothing. Yeah, definitely need to make that adjustment. Right, well you've seen me make that adjustment before, so I won't bother with that. Or perhaps I will. Okay, so back into the camera. Remove the rewind knob. 2 screws here. One at the end of the body. And before I remove the camera top, we need that control knob on. Taking note of where the setting is over here, it was between 18 and 17. Lift that off, hold my finger on the meter so nothing gets disturbed, lift that off. My adjustment, can't see it much easily with the shutter and the meter in place, so I'll remove the meter for your benefit. Slacken that screw off, lift my meter out of the way. I only need to slacken the screw off because this loop's broken, which is its normal state. And the screw we're interested in is this one right here. And what's happening is we're not releasing the film advance early enough in the stroke, so I need to back that screw up slightly. So I'll just back it up very slightly. I'll put my meter back in place. Get that screw back in place. Put my top cover back in place and holding that between finger and thumb. Let's see how we get on. That's it. That was all that was wanted. So 2 screws into the top cover at this end. One screw at the end of the top cover here. Our meter dial here should be around fully clockwise so that the 18 is sitting at about this position. Get this washer back in place. Get the screw in place. Run that most of the way down and then make sure that the ASA scale is set in the correct position. That line should be between 18 and 17 there. That hasn't moved at all. Tip that screw up, check that it still hasn't moved. No, that's good. So everything now is back together. Well, I suppose I better put the rewind knob back on for completeness. Make sure that's a 2-stage action. If it's not, it means that you haven't got that correctly seated so that the inner is not moving correctly in there. Alright, so that is our 3C. apparently all functioning, and it should be good to go. Be a good camera to use in this state. Of course, I haven't given it my normal level of service, so that's something I'll have to attend to before I let this thing go. But basically that looks good. We fixed the problems that the camera came in with. There was a distinct problem with the synchronization of the shutter release and the release of the film advance. The shutter would not work at all on the slow speeds. Now that's working nice and smoothly, and the self-timer, which I probably didn't even test while the shutter was on the camera because there wasn't a great likelihood of that working nicely. The rangefinder, we can see through it now and it's accurate. It was an extremely hazy mess. You may have seen a very brief clip in the earlier videos where you couldn't really see through it. It was just about opaque. And do we do anything else of interest to it? Not a great deal really. Those were the major problems, and those major problems are all gone. Oh, of course the screw was missing from the door at the bottom of the camera, so it didn't open and close properly, and that's been dealt with. Okay, so thanks for watching so far. For my next task, I'm going to strip the camera down completely and service the body as I would normally have done. Of course, I'm not going to have to service the rangefinder, and I'm not going to have to service the shutter because I've already done those. So those two sub-assemblies can just be put to one side while I work on the camera body.